Silence is often misunderstood as weakness, hesitation, or even defeat. But in reality, it's one of the most strategic forms of communication you have, especially when dealing with toxic individuals. These people operate on a very predictable system: stimulus and response. They provoke, you react. That reaction, whether it's anger, defensiveness, or even justification, becomes their leverage. It gives them information. It gives them control, and most importantly, it confirms that they can influence your internal state. When you choose silence, you interrupt that entire system. Now, this isn't passive silence. It's not avoidance or suppression. It's deliberate non-engagement. There's a difference. You're not staying quiet because you don't know what to say. You're staying quiet because you understand the outcome of saying anything at all. That level of restraint requires awareness. It requires discipline. And that's exactly why it's so disorienting to someone who expects easy access to your reactions. From a psychological standpoint, humans are wired to seek feedback. When someone throws a comment, an insult, or a subtle manipulation your way, they're anticipating a return signal. When that signal doesn't come, it creates a gap in uncomfortable cognitive space. And toxic individuals who rely heavily on predictable emotional exchanges don't handle that gap well. They start to second guess. They escalate, or they withdraw. Either way, the dynamic shifts. Philosophically, silence represents control over the self. It's the decision to not be governed by external triggers. Most people live reactively. They're pulled in different directions by whatever or whoever demands their attention. But the moment you stop reacting automatically, you reclaim authorship over your behavior. You're no longer participating in someone else's script. And here's the part most people miss. Silence doesn't mean you're disengaged from reality. It means you're choosing your battles with precision. You're conserving energy. You're observing patterns. You're deciding when, if ever, a response is actually necessary. Over time, this changes how people perceive you. You become harder to read, harder to manipulate, and significantly harder to control. And for a toxic person, that's deeply unsettling. Because the truth is simple: when they can't get a reaction, they lose their power. And when you master silence, you stop being a participant in their game and become the one who quietly rewrites the rules. If silence disrupts the pattern, the next move deepens that disruption. Stop explaining yourself. Most people don't realize how much of their communication is driven by an unconscious need for approval. They make a decision, and almost immediately, they feel compelled to justify it. They add context, soften their stance, and offer layers of explanation, not because the situation demands it, but because they're trying to manage how others perceive them. And this is exactly where toxic individuals find their opening. Because every explanation is data. When you over-explain, you reveal your motivations, your insecurities, your priorities, and sometimes even your doubts. You're essentially handing someone a blueprint of how to challenge you. A toxic person doesn't listen to understand you, they listen to find leverage. They look for inconsistencies, emotional pressure points, or anything they can reframe to regain control of the interaction. So when you remove the explanation, you remove the leverage. Now, this doesn't mean you become cold or dismissive. It means you become precise. There's a difference between clarity and overexposure. Clarity is stating your position in a clean, direct way. Overexposure is when you keep talking past the point of necessity, trying to make your decision more acceptable to someone who has no intention of accepting it anyway. For example, instead of saying, "I can't make it because I've had a long week, and I really need to rest, and I've been dealing with a lot lately," you simply say, "I won't be able to make it." That's it. No excess detail. No emotional padding. Just a decision. What happens next is where things get interesting. Toxic individuals often expect that extra layer of explanation. It's part of the social script they rely on. When it's missing, they feel it immediately. There's a pause, a subtle confusion. They might probe for more information, push for justification, or try to create discomfort in the silence that follows. But if you hold your ground calmly, without adding more, they lose their footing. Psychologically, this ties into the concept of perceived authority. People who are confident in their decisions don't feel the need to defend them excessively. Their behavior signals certainty. and certainty, even when it's quiet, carries weight. It shifts the dynamic from seeking approval to establishing position. Philosophically, it's about ownership. When you explain yourself too much, you're outsourcing the validation of your choices. You're saying in a subtle way, I need you to agree with me for this to be okay. But when you stop doing that, you reclaim ownership. Your decisions stand on their own, independent of external approval. And this is deeply unsettling for toxic people because they operate on influence. They need entry points into your thinking. They need something to question, to twist, or to negotiate. When you give them less to work with, their usual strategies become ineffective. They can't argue with what isn't there. They can't dissect a decision that isn't wrapped in layers of justification. Over time, this changes the entire interaction pattern. You become someone who is not easily pulled into debates, not easily guilted into compliance, and not easily manipulated through emotional pressure. You're still communicating, but you're doing it on your terms, with intention. There's also an internal shift that happens here. The less you explain yourself, the more you're forced to trust your own judgment. You start to notice that most decisions don't actually require external validation. They require internal alignment. And once that alignment is in place, the need to justify disappears naturally. This doesn't mean you never explain anything. Context matters. In healthy relationships, explanation can build understanding. But with toxic individuals, the goal is different. It's not about mutual understanding, it's about maintaining control over your own behavior. And that requires restraint. So the next time you feel that urge to add just one more reason or to make your decision more palatable, pause. Recognize that impulse for what it is, a conditioned response to seek approval, and then choose differently. Say less. Mean it more. Because the moment you stop explaining yourself unnecessarily is the moment your decisions start carrying real weight. And when your words become fewer but stronger, you don't just communicate differently, you position yourself in a way that no longer invites manipulation. Once you stop over-explaining, the next shift becomes visible in your behavior, how accessible you are. And this is where most people unknowingly give away their leverage. Accessibility is not just about time. It's about emotional availability, responsiveness, and predictability. Toxic individuals pay close attention to these patterns. They notice how quickly you reply, how often you adjust your schedule, how easily you can be pulled into a conversation. Over time, they build an internal model of you, one that tells them exactly when and how they can reach you, influence you, or interrupt your focus. And once that model is established, control becomes easy. So when you begin to limit your accessibility, you're not just creating space, you're disrupting a pattern they've come to rely on. This doesn't require confrontation. In fact, the most effective changes are often subtle. You take longer to respond. You don't immediately pick up every call. You become more selective about when you engage and when you don't. From the outside, it doesn't look dramatic, but from their perspective, it introduces uncertainty. And uncertainty is uncomfortable for someone who depends on predictability. Psychologically, this ties into reinforcement patterns. If someone is used to getting consistent responses from you, your behavior has trained them to expect access. It's a form of conditioning, but the moment that pattern becomes inconsistent, the dynamic shifts. They can no longer anticipate your behavior with the same confidence. And when predictability disappears, so does a significant portion of their control. Now, here's where people often make a mistake. They think limiting accessibility means becoming distant or rude. It doesn't. It means becoming intentional. There's a difference between being unavailable and being unavailable by design. One is reactive, the other is controlled. You're not ignoring people to make a point. You're structuring your time and energy in a way that aligns with your priorities. And that alignment sends a message without you ever having to say it out loud. Access to you is not automatic. Philosophically, this is about reclaiming ownership of your attention. In a world where constant availability is normalized, choosing when and how you engage becomes a form of discipline. Most people allow their environment to dictate their behavior, notifications, messages, demands from others. But when you reverse that dynamic, when you decide that your attention is something you allocate rather than something that gets taken, your entire presence changes. You become less reactive, more deliberate. And toxic individuals notice this immediately, because their influence depends on immediacy. They rely on catching you off guard, pulling you into conversations before you've had time to think, or creating urgency where none actually exists. But when you slow down your responses, when create space between stimulus and reaction, you remove that advantage. They may test this. They might send multiple messages, escalate their tone, or try to create a sense of guilt around your unavailability. This is predictable. It's an attempt to restore the old pattern. But if you remain consistent, calm, measured, and unaffected, the message becomes clear without you ever stating it directly. Your time is not negotiable by default. There's also an internal benefit here that often goes unnoticed. When you reduce unnecessary accessibility, you create space for reflection. You're no longer constantly reacting to incoming demands. You have time to think, to evaluate, to decide. And that space is where better decisions are made. Over time, this builds a different kind of confidence. Not the loud, performative kind, but a quiet certainty in how you operate. You're no longer available out of habit or obligation. You're available by choice. And that distinction changes everything, because when people realize they can't reach you whenever they want, they start to approach you differently. They become more intentional, more respectful of your time. Or, in the case of toxic individuals, they begin to lose interest because the easy access they relied on is no longer there. And without access, their influence fades. So the goal isn't to withdraw from the world, it's to become deliberate in how you show up in it. To recognize that your time, your energy, and your attention are finite resources and to treat them accordingly. Because the moment you stop being constantly available is the moment you start becoming selectively valuable. And when access to you is no longer guaranteed, neither is anyone's ability to control you. As your accessibility becomes more intentional, the next shift happens internally: how you manage your emotional responses in real time. Because toxic individuals are not just observing what you do, they're studying how you feel. More specifically, they are looking for ways to influence those feelings. Emotional reactivity is one of the most reliable entry points for manipulation. If someone can trigger frustration, anger, or defensiveness in you, they've already altered your decision-making process. You're no longer operating from clarity or reacting from impulse, and that's exactly the environment where toxic behavior thrives. So the move here is simple in concept, but difficult in execution: emotional neutrality. This doesn't mean you become emotionless. It means you become controlled. You feel everything, but you don't display everything. There's a gap between the emotion and the expression, and in that gap, you decide what happens next. When a toxic person makes a comment designed to provoke you, they're not just testing your patience, they're testing your predictability. They expect a certain reaction because that's what they've seen before, either from you or from others. But when that reaction doesn't come when you respond, calmly, briefly, or not at all, it disrupts their expectation. And that disruption creates instability on their side. Psychologically, this is powerful because it removes reinforcement. If their behavior no longer produces the emotional payoff they're used to, it starts to lose its purpose. Over time, the attempts either intensify briefly or fade away altogether. But in both cases, the dynamic changes because you're no longer participating in the emotional exchange they rely on. There's also a deeper layer to this. Emotional neutrality signals self-regulation. It shows that your internal state is not easily influenced by external pressure. And that signal, even when it's subtle, changes how people engage with you. You become someone who is harder to provoke, harder to read, and ultimately harder to manipulate. Philosophically, this is about sovereignty over the self. Most people believe their emotions are automatic responses to the world around them, but in reality, there's always a moment, however brief, where a choice exists, a choice to escalate or to remain steady, a choice to react or to observe. And when you consistently choose observation over reaction, something shifts. You're no longer pulled into every situation. You start to see patterns more clearly. You recognize when someone is trying to provoke you, not because you feel overwhelmed, but because you're no longer inside the reaction. That distance is where control lives. It's not about suppressing emotion, it's about directing it. channeling it in a way that serves you rather than exposing it in a way that serves someone else's agenda. Because once your emotions are no longer easily accessible, neither is your behavior. And when someone loses the ability to control how you feel, they lose the ability to control what you do. By the time you've learned to manage your silence, limit your explanations, control your accessibility, and regulate your emotional responses, something else begins to happen to you. Behavior starts to change in subtle but decisive ways. And this is where boundaries come into play, not as something you announce, but as something you demonstrate. Most people think of boundaries as verbal declarations. They imagine a moment where they clearly state what they will and won't tolerate. And while that has its place, it often becomes performative, especially with toxic individuals. Because when you announce a boundary to someone who is already inclined to test limits, what you're really doing is giving them a line to push against. So instead of declaring boundaries, you begin to embody them. This means your behavior shifts first, and your words become secondary or sometimes unnecessary. You say no without over-explaining. You disengage from conversations that don't serve you. You stop participating in dynamics that drain your energy. And most importantly, you remain consistent in those actions. Consistency is what makes a boundary real. Toxic individuals are highly attuned to inconsistency. If your behavior fluctuates, if you enforce a boundary one day and relax it the next, they interpret that as flexibility, as an opening, and they will adjust their approach accordingly. But when your actions remain steady over time, without emotional escalation or repeated justification, then you are more likely to achieve your goals. The message becomes clear without ever being explicitly stated. This creates a different kind of confusion. Because they're used to verbal negotiations, they expect resistance in the form of arguments, explanations, or emotional reactions. That's the arena where they operate best. But when the resistance is behavioral, quiet, consistent, and non-negotiable, they lose that advantage. There's nothing to debate, nothing to reframe. Just a pattern they can't break. Psychologically, this works because it removes ambiguity. Words can be interpreted, challenged, or ignored. But behavior is harder to dispute. When you consistently act in a way that reflects your limits, people are forced to adjust to that reality. Not because they agree with it, but because it's the only version of you they can access. And for a toxic person, that lack of access is disorienting. They may try to provoke a reaction, to pull you back into the old dynamic where things were more negotiable. They might question your change, label it as cold or distant, or attempt to guilt you into reverting. But these are all predictable responses to a loss of control. And if your behavior remains unchanged, those tactics lose their effectiveness over time. There's also a philosophical layer to this that's worth understanding. When you stop announcing boundaries and start living them, you shift from external validation to internal alignment. You're no longer seeking agreement from others or acting in accordance with your own standards. And that alignment creates a sense of stability that doesn't depend on how others respond. You become less concerned with being understood and more focused on being consistent. And that shift is powerful because it changes the nature of your interactions entirely. You're no longer negotiating your limits in real time. You've already decided them. Your behavior reflects that decision, and others either adapt or they don't. But either way, the boundary holds. Over time, this builds a reputation not through what you say, but through what you consistently do. People begin to recognize that certain behaviors simply don't work with you. That certain lines, once crossed, lead to disengagement rather than discussion. And that recognition, even if it's unspoken, shapes how they approach you moving forward. For toxic individuals, this is particularly unsettling. Because their strategies rely on flexibility, on finding cracks in your responses, on identifying moments where they can push just a little further. But when those cracks disappear, when your behavior becomes stable and predictable in a way that protects your boundaries, their strategies start to fail. And when those strategies fail repeatedly, one of two things happens. They either change their approach or they remove themselves from the interaction altogether. Both outcomes work in your favor. So the goal isn't to make a statement, it's to create a pattern of behavior that reflects your limits so clearly that it doesn't require explanation. Because in the end, the strongest boundaries are not the ones you announce there, the ones you consistently live. And when your actions speak with that level of clarity, you don't just set limits, you become someone those limits can't be negotiated with. By the time you've made all these shifts, how you respond, what you say, when you engage, and what you tolerate, there's one final move that ties everything together. And it's deceptively simple. You stop focusing on the toxic person altogether. Because attention is currency. Where your attention goes, your energy follows. And toxic individuals rely on this more than anything else. They don't just want reactions, they want relevance in your mind. They want to occupy your thoughts, influence your decisions, and remain a central figure in your mental space, even when they're not physically present. So when you redirect that attention toward your own growth, you're not just disengaging, you're removing their significance. This is where the real shift happens. Instead of analyzing their behavior, you start refining your own. Instead of replaying conversations, you invest that mental energy into building something, your skills, your discipline, your clarity. You become oriented toward progress rather than conflict. And this creates a kind of psychological asymmetry. Because while they're still operating within the same pattern, seeking control, provoking reactions, trying to maintain influence, you've moved on to a completely different framework. You're no longer playing the same game. In fact, you're not playing at all. That absence is what confuses them the most. There's no tension to feed on, no argument to win, no emotional thread to pull, just distance created not through avoidance, but through evolution. And evolution is difficult to challenge because it's not reactive, it's directional. From a psychological perspective, this works because it breaks the feedback loop entirely. Toxic dynamics depend on mutual participation. Even resistance can keep the cycle going if it's emotionally charged. But when your focus shifts inward toward growth, toward purpose, that loop loses its continuity. You're no longer reinforcing the dynamic. Philosophically, this is about reclaiming authorship over your life. It's the recognition that not every conflict deserves your attention, and not every person deserves a role in your story. Growth requires selectivity. It requires you to decide consciously what you invest in and what you leave behind. And that decision, once made, simplifies everything. You stop asking, "How do I deal with this person?" and start asking, "What am I building instead?" That question changes your trajectory. It moves you forward rather than keeping you anchored in someone else's behavior. Over time, this creates distance that doesn't need to be enforced. It happens naturally. Your priorities shift, your environment changes, and the people who once had influence over you become less relevant, not because you pushed them away, but because you outgrew the dynamic entirely. And that's the final move. Because when your life becomes centered on growth, toxic people don't just lose control, they lose access. And when someone no longer has access to your time, your energy, or your attention, they don't just lose influence, they disappear from the equation entirely.